Okay, next up, we have on the agenda is the review of the non-concurrence for 132-18 from Chief Geyer. I did have some questions that I typed up. Brad, would you like a copy or?
Sure.
Okay. So anyway, I'll go ahead and start with this. So in this letter, if we read down where it says non-concurrence, it says here that he has reviewed 2 investigations where the non-concurrence between the 2 investigating components. But what are the 2 components? I don't understand what he's talking about.
You can't figure this out unless you have all of it committed to memory. So can you give us a narrative of what he's saying in the non-concurrence? What I want to know in 132-18 is how are the CPOA and IA findings different one from the other? And then where is the chief in that?
Let me get to the, sorry. Okay, sorry. So, what was your question again?
My question is, the chief is saying in this particular instance, officer, these things, the APD IA investigation and the CPOA investigation are concurrent. In this next stack of them, they're non-concurrent. So with the officer's names crossed out, he's saying, APD sustains the allegations and CPOA unfounded in the same case, in the same incident. I want to understand what IA's comparison was to what we did. If they're comparing the same event, how is it that APD sustained it and we've unfounded it? I don't understand.
Well, I think as far as Officer A, and I can't, this is the chief's memo, so I can't really speak to the chief, but I can go to what...
That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to compare the IA investigation to our investigation and tell me where they're different.
Right, and as I discussed at the POB meeting, Officer A was sustained for making a comment that the department in their IA case found to be rude and disparaging against a CYFD worker, which was their interpretation, and we did not sustain for that.
Why not?
My opinion was that it didn't rise to that level.
Okay, and that's the first one in non-concurrence in his report?
Correct. Okay. The second 2, I'm sorry, for the 2 officers, they were sustained for not tagging video so that it would be preserved beyond the 120 days.
That's what the IA findings were?
That's what the IA findings were. I don't believe that we looked at that as it relates to those officers over that expanse of instances.
That expanse being 2012 to
2012 through 2018.
Okay, so we weren't looking at the same problem?
Not in all instances, no.
Okay, and then is that item 2 on this non-concurrence list?
That would be for Officer L and Officer C.
I gotcha. Okay. And that's the on-body recording device, not extended.
Correct. It wasn't tagged properly so that we would have been preserved beyond the 120-day time frame.
I gotcha. Okay. And you're saying, it says that you found that unfounded. So this is saying that
I
you
don't
did
think
look at it.
I don't think it's really an apple-to-apple, oranges-to-oranges comparison, simply because I think it's because I don't think it's a incident-by-incident examination. It's a more broad examination of the entire investigation. So it's not on January 1st, this incident happened, and IA sustained and we did not. I don't think it's a completely apple-for-apple examination.
So on this Officer L and Officer C, you're saying that where it says CPOA unfounded the same, you're saying that's not correct?
We unfounded, but I don't believe it, because it's not, we didn't look at the issue of the recording.
So what did you unfound on?
For other incidents.
Okay, after reading the report by IA, was there anything in the IA report that made you concerned that you should have looked at some things that you didn't?
No.
Okay, and why is that? Because they were going back, if I understand you correctly, they're drilling down on each incident, and you're looking at the big picture over.
We looked at incidences all the way going back to 2012 to see.
And these officers were part of that over time? Some
of them, yes. And so that's why I say it's not an incident by incident comparison, as opposed to in 132-18 we unfounded for the officer in the case, and it may not be for the same exact incident as Internal Affairs was looking at the investigation.
Okay.
The reason that I'm confident that the investigations were complete is that even the sustained that Internal Affairs found, they were minor things that resulted in only a verbal reprimand. So the larger aspects of the case that had everyone concerned, there were found to be no violations as it relates to that.
Okay, we'll get to that some more in a minute. So then about the detective, in item 3 on non-concurrence, it says that the detective,
Right.
Tell me about that one.
I believe that this would be for the case where we sustained for not following up on an investigation, and APD is exonerating for doing that.
And what's the difference in the rationale between your logic and theirs?
I don't know. There isn't an explanation.
But you have the whole investigative file.
I have the file, yes.
So what did they say?
They didn't examine it in the same context. There are things that we saw that APD didn't see, and there are things that APD saw that we didn't see.
So explain how it's different in this, because I am not looking at any of that, so I need help figuring out.
I will have to go, and I will have to put it all together for you.
Okay, so from the public vantage point, there's a case that involves a 7-year-old girl who obviously her family has a long history, and you've explained to us in the past that this family moves from location to location, and it's a hotel motel kind of living situation and different jurisdictions, and that our staff person went over 5 years worth of this in great detail and drilled down on that to see how did the system fail this girl. And yet the end result of this, as we see the comparison the chief is making and what we've learned from your examination, is that it doesn't sound like anybody's really culpable other than not following up, or not, there's some technical violation. So is it your opinion generally that the systems by which the system this girl was affected by is not only failed her, but fails, period, in the process by which these cases are handled? Is it so frequent that there is, in the pass-off between CYFD and the police department, is it so frequent that this is a misstep, that we should be looking at it structurally? Is it, what should we know about this case? Because for the public and for whom we are representatives, it is hard to imagine that over a 5-year period of time, no interception happened despite all of these incidents that you document, that your staff has documented. So what is your take on that, both in the individual case and overarching systemically? What have you learned in the course of studying 5 years of this child's life?
Well, I think that there have been some changes that would or could have possibly affected this case, with the fact that now all complaints receive a dispatch, where that didn't happen in the past.
Explain that.
All referrals for child abuse or neglect get a dispatched call, as opposed to a simply
An officer goes out.
Right. So there's that aspect that has changed over time. The second aspect is, I believe that there's been some changes in RTCC. Tracking, so that it's name-based as opposed to address-based.
And that's a change that's happened how recently?
I believe that's part of the new policies that they wrote as a result of this case. I think that when you look at it, when we looked at all of the contacts, we looked at what the officers did. There were officers that went over and above in this case that were concerned about these children, but they were able to maintain a minimum threshold within the context when there was officer contact for their living and their standards. I think that it's questions that would have to be examined more deeply in a broader aspect, as opposed to call by call specific in this case.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking the question both ways. I'm asking call by call. There has to be a critical mass at some point. We're going from when this girl was 6, to when she was 11. Isn't that right? Oh no, she was 7. So if it's 5 years, she was 2. So 2 years old to 7 years old, and we have how many incidents?
29 calls to CYFD, right?
So the teachers are saying this is outside our comfort zone, and they're being recognized, rightly so, for their perseverance in this. And yet the systems, the CYFD and APD, somehow failed. How does that work?
I think there's a bit of mischaracterization, because the teacher related to the evidence didn't call for 24 hours. She only called after the child didn't come to school the next day. So yes, it was certainly on the teacher's radar, but this is and there. I don't have the answers. I mean, honestly, I don't have the answers. I don't know. I don't have specific recommendations. I know that there have been recommendations based upon a task force under other high-profile cases.
In your study of this 5 years, some of those cases, Omar Varela, for example, and Victoria Martins, both happened in this time frame, and I'm sure there are others. So I know that after the Omar Varela case, there was a task force put together and some recommendations. Did your study of this 5-year period show you any difference
No, because we didn't really study it that way. We simply were looking at incidents to examine whether or not there were policy violations. I think that looking at it more broadly that's the purview of this body and the board for those ramifications.
I think we have to come to some terms with this, because we as a board are looking at trends and we are trying to figure out where the systems are broken to make recommendations from a communal standpoint. And as you know, we have a meeting set up with the chief to discuss these particular cases in this whole committee, and you will be part of that. And that's part of the overarching piece. And we will certainly have the opportunity to ask those questions and see. I think it's really hard for the community to see this 5 years worth of calls on a child, and everybody's just looking at counting the P's instead of looking at the big picture. And that's part of the problem. So we will have that conversation, all four of us will have that conversation with the chief. But as a community, we have to do better. And I understand that the task of the staff is to look at the incidents and say, was there a violation of policy here or there? But that's not the only thing this board needs to do. And so we will meet with the chief and come back to the board as a whole with a summary of what we've found.
Well, I was just at a presentation by some members of the CAC, the Crimes Against Children's Unit, last week, Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And one of their goals is to change the standard by which the courts and the systems operate, which is family unification, reunification, as opposed to what's in the best interest of the child being the top priority. And they cite Arkansas as an example of when the system changed its priorities, then children were better off. And I think that is one of the aspects that the CACU would like to examine with the legislature.
I would like to see the report that the task force came up with after Omar Varela. Do you have that?
I don't.
Can you get it for us?
I could try.
I would like it for the board meeting. I'd like the board to get copies of that. And if we can get it before our meeting with Chief Geyer, I'd like to do that. So I'd like to know for myself what that says. Yes, ma'am.
Outreach starts at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
We have 6 minutes over.
Okay.
It's good to give us a heads up.
So a couple of things on this. I still don't have an answer as to why. So after, I believe it was after Victoria Martins, former board member Larson, worked on an RTCC order that basically would correct one systemic problem we see, which was that officers were arriving to call-outs that involved possible endangerment of children without any knowledge of, an extremely long history of previous call-outs. And so that was an issue that was identified, I believe it was after Victoria Martins. And so then there was written a new RTCC procedural order that corrected that, so that an officer would, upon a call out involving a child, be familiar with that history. We saw indicators that order was not followed in this case, because the officers were making comments such as, "I wish I would have known this, I wish I would have known that before I did this or before I concluded that." And had had that been properly implemented in this case, I don't think those officers would have been making those same statements. And I still don't have any answer as to whether or not a violation existed there. I don't have any sign that, that's been investigated. And I'm still expecting to get answers from that because we have sent this case back to the CPOA. So our investigation isn't done, and I'm really hoping to see that. I would really like for us as a board to ask to review the IA investigation. And the reason why is because I have a real problem with the uncollected evidence. So it's sounding like, the CPOA didn't sustain a violation. It sounds like, Internal Affairs also did not, although I don't know for sure whether or not they analyzed it because I can't see the investigation at this time. But if a girl shows up to school, a 7-year-old, with a large blood stain in her underwear, it stands to reason she may have been recently sexually assaulted. Those underwear might have contained forensic evidence that could identify the person who had assaulted her. So I can't, so perhaps it is true, perhaps it's true that there was no SOP violation, but if the way our SOPs are written do not require those underwear to be collected, then that is something we need to fix, right? Because we have the ability to make SOP recommendations to address these. That's a huge gaping hole, in my opinion, that those underwear didn't get collected. And I have reviewed those SOPs, and I think there could be a question about when something is or is not a crime scene. Maybe that's what it boiled down to. But if, we need to it has to be one of two things. There had to have been a violation there, or the SOP is bad, right? One or the other.
One of those two.
Yeah, and I really, really want an answer on that. That way we can move forward on making recommendations if that's what we're going to be doing.
Well, let's ask for that specifically, because if we're going to move this to the non-consent agenda, let's have those answers for us. Did you let's have it for the board.
Okay, but I don't think that case is back before us yet, because here we're just reviewing the non-concurrence, right? And so I think there are a few more pieces to our investigation that we're hoping to see, and then the other big one I think is that it seemed like there were issues with the officer's police report after the call out to the school, that it did not contain all the facts it should have contained, and maybe there might have even been instances where it wasn't forthright. I'm not certain. That has been alleged, so we'll see how that turns out. But I definitely think that we need to not let this be the ending of this case, because we might have to have some policy work to do.
Well, let's be very specific about what we want. So let me first ask this question. Mr. Harness, on the issue of evidence not being collected, I'm assuming the staff did look at that.
We did, and so did the department.
Okay, and so what did you find and what did they find?
That there was no evidence of a crime based upon the interviews of the subjects, and therefore there was no need to collect.
And that makes no sense to the general public. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sure it doesn't make sense to anybody. But that may be because we're ignorant about something. So tell me why I'm ignorant about that. Why is that incorrect for me to think that?
Officers along with CYFD detectives went out. They interviewed. They did an interview with the alleged victim. There was nothing that raised their level to even a reasonable suspicion that a crime had been committed, let alone probable cause. So therefore, they determined that there was no need to collect it.
So
after
our obligation,
after this was clothing that had been discarded for 24 hours, and there had been an examination by the school nurse.
Of the child or of the underwear?
Of the child.
Okay. So I think what Chelsea is bringing up is a legitimate point in terms of our process. It is true that we are here to review existing SOPs. We're also here to identify gaping holes in SOPs. So my question is, which of this is that? If, there will never be a good relationship between the community and the police department if we are not able to discuss what we need to understand on each side of that line between us. What the community sees is a 7-year-old girl who had bloody underwear and a cop that didn't collect it, didn't think it was worth it. You can say probable cause to the cows come home. It doesn't matter if people think that should have happened. And if it shouldn't have happened, we need to understand why. And saying probable cause doesn't answer that question. So I would say that this is a communication problem that needs to be solved, that needs to be taken a look at. And what I'm asking the agency for, and what I will ask the chief for, is to understand how that happens. How is it that you can skip over that, because that makes no sense to just the general peanut butter and jelly crowd like me. And I want to understand it, because otherwise I think they were wrong to not do it. And if I need to be educated, this is a good time to do that. Educate me now.
Okay. I mean, I understand your point of view, and I'm just offering it as the analysis that they did, as what they believe to be the legal requirements.
Structurally, I would say to you that it is our hope that not only we identify places where there are gaps in SOP clarity, but we would hope that based on your experience of going through all these cases, yours and the staff, that you would say, this could be better if we did this, or we recommend that somebody look into this part, or it's being done differently in someplace other community. That would be really helpful to us from a task standpoint, not just the checklist of SOPs that exist. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
My closing thought here is that, if the reason why the underwear wasn't collected, the reason is that there was no probable cause to believe a crime had been committed, then I would say the various actors in these systems are not being very honest. Because 5 years being a public defender, I have seen hundreds, if not thousands of cases tried and convicted on much less evidence, nevertheless, charged. We had a young girl, a teacher complained she came to school, hungry, smelling of urine and feces, unkempt, with her hair and nails did, saying things like that suggested she was committing crimes with her parents, a blood stain in her underwear, which doesn't make really sense outside the context of potential criminality. There was probable cause to believe child endangerment had been occurring. There were multiple witnesses to it, and in fact, now we have a case in front of the district court based on the evidence that already existed at that time, and both parents in jail, awaiting trial. So it's just not, it's not honest to say that there was not probable cause here. There was.
I'm still convinced that we don't have all the information, and I'll feel better once we have a chance to talk to the chief.
And all of those incidents did not all happen at one time. She did not show up, made up, and then unkempt and all that, because the day that the teacher relayed to the officers about her showing up in makeup and all that, the teacher did not call the police at that point in time. And so the police were not made aware of it at that point in time. That came out later. So you can't lump all of this together and say all this happened right then and there, and that's what should have been examined, because there were incidences that were reported, and then there were incidences that were not reported that came out later on. So it's unfair to say that officers were operating under the knowledge as it was just relayed, because it's not true. It was piecemeal.
Let me ask you this question. So over that 5-year period of time when they were mobile, did the girls remain in the same school?
I don't know that. I have to go back. I don't know. I can't say that off the top of my head.
Because that would account if she was in different schools. that would account for the school not having a 5-year running total of what was going on. I think it's something we should know.
I mean, definitely it's the case that, you know, the charges have been brought, and they've made it past a preliminary inquiry hearing, which is there to ascertain whether or not probable cause exists in any given case, based on the evidence that existed at the time of the school call out. And that is the same exact evidence that's being analyzed for whether or not those underwear should have been collected. So, you know, the court's determination of probable cause and everybody else's determination of probable cause are, you know, on two completely different planets, and that doesn't make any sense. And so, I mean, even if there were pieces of evidence that I mentioned just now that maybe weren't there, I still think the bigger picture was, you know, it was there, and it is
So
there.
there's no question that this is a communication challenge, an understanding challenge that we need to understand. And the RTCC thing is a really important piece of that. Changing that is because it was based on address. That's how the RTCC thing was set up. And if the address keeps changing, you're not going to see the pattern. So doing it by the person's name is a good change. I don't know when that happened, but it's going to make it easier to be able to pull up that name. Because you have mobility in these situations and it's tough. So
I'd like to propose that, that we put this on next month's agenda, and by then we will already have talked to Chief Geyer, and we have lots of questions for him. So then we can come back here as a board and discuss what he said, and
this
take a
is
look
really
closer
central to our task here.
Uh-huh.
It's central. This is the kind of case that makes you want to have oversight.
Right.
As a
okay.
community.
So that's what I propose, that we
Yeah.
place this back on next month's agenda.
I agree.
And we'll have discussion.
Is
And
that
I'll
the
discuss
POV
with-
agenda or the CRC agenda?
The CRC.
The CRC agenda, excuse me, the CRC agenda. And then I will discuss with Ed to the time allotment, so we'll have lots of time to discuss what we've learned and how we can move forward.
Well, we need to, after our meeting with Geyer, we need to prepare a report to the board.
All right.
So that,
And we're still also waiting on the return of the investigation from the CPOA, because we did send it back.
so it sounds like Geyer had something to compare it to. That Geyer must have had a finished product before.
Well, yeah, we had already sent that, because of the time limit for disciplinary recommendations.
Right.
But then at a previous board
Right.
meeting, we sent
I
it back
remember
for
now.
further investigation, so.
Gotcha.
So hopefully we'll have that by the next CRC meeting, the finished product. Yeah.
This isn't over because it can't be over, because
No.
we still don't get it. You know, the community still doesn't get it, and that's part of the problem. So let's get more information and see what
Okay,
we
so
can.
do I have a motion to place this
Yes.
conversation on next month, case review committee agenda?
Yes.
And a second?
I second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.